Bayard Rustin arrived in Montgomery, Alabama in February 1956, in the midst of Martin Luther King's campaign to end segregation on the city's buses. At 44, Rustin had organized numerous civil rights demonstrations in the South and had spent much of the last decade publicly advocating nonviolent protest. Now, he would help King make these techniques the centerpiece of his movement's strategy.
It is my firm conviction that God is working in Montgomery.
By the time the U.S. Supreme Court ruled segregation on the Montgomery buses unconstitutional, Rustin had become one of King's most trusted advisors and a highly influential strategist for the movement.
In the course of the boycott, Rustin and King developed a very close working relationship, and it's Bayard Rustin who draws up the original plans for what becomes the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Between 1956 and 1960, Rustin very consciously strategizes how to give Martin Luther King a national profile as a leader. And King has the opportunity to address a national audience and be catapulted into the media.
Do you understand that that is a new Negro in the South?
King owed much to his alliance with Rustin. But because Rustin was gay, it was an alliance that would also make his leadership vulnerable to attack.
In 1960, Adam Clayton Powell, who was a congressman representing Harlem, gives a speech in upstate New York in which he says that the civil rights movement is in danger of being captured by subversives and by insidious secret influences. He was referring to Bayard Rustin. Powell lets it be known to Martin Luther King that unless he dismisses Rustin, Powell threatens to reveal that King and Rustin were having a sexual affair. Now, there's not a shred of truth to it. There was no sexual affair. There was nothing being done that could have discredited the civil rights movement. The only thing that was being done was the threat of a lie by a rival black leader. Rustin offers King his resignation, and King accepts it. And, you know, Rustin was devastated and flabbergasted. I mean, he fully expected that King would stand by him, that King would call Powell's bluff, and instead King, in this particular instance, panicked, and Rustin was pulled out of the loop of the civil rights movement for a number of years. It was one of the most difficult moments in Bayard Rustin's life.
I know now that for me, sex must be sublimated if I am to live with myself and in this world longer.
For the next 3 years, Rustin kept his distance from King. During that time, white opposition to the civil rights movement intensified, and the South erupted in violence. Finally, in June of 1963, black leaders began planning a march on Washington to urge the federal government to intervene. Movement veterans once again turned to Rustin for help.
In June of 1963, we had a closed-door, serious meeting about who was going to lead the march and who was going to be head of the March on Washington. A. Philip Randolph wanted Bayard to be the leader. And in the mind of Martin Luther King Jr. and myself, there was no one better prepared to lead and give direction and mobilize. Rustin was the person. But Roy Wilkins, as head of the NAACP, felt that Rustin couldn't be the person because it would be embarrassing to the march, embarrassing to the movement, because he was gay. But we knew that if we selected A. Philip Randolph and give him the power to select his deputy, a selected person who would put the March on Washington together, he would select Rustin, and that's exactly what happened.
Rustin had less than 2 months to organize what was expected to be the largest peaceful demonstration in American history. He took over a rundown office in Harlem and with a small staff set to work. Within days, he had raised over $15,000 to bring the poor to Washington, drafted a mission statement for the march, and designed a plan for security. He contracted with bus companies to transport the marchers, arranged for 1,000 beds to be made available to those arriving the night before, and even enlisted hundreds of volunteers to prepare bagged lunches for those who had not brought their own food.
Whenever Bayard was working on a major civil rights initiative, to some degree, he must have felt like a walking time bomb, wondering when something was going to happen.
It is against the law for demonstrations to be held on Capitol grounds.
And just before the March on Washington, at a critical moment for the civil rights movement, Strom Thurmond, a segregationist senator from South Carolina, stands up on the floor of the Senate and accuses Rustin of being a sex pervert, and manages to have even the record of Rustin's arrest on a sex charge in Pasadena 10 years earlier.
Now let me make it quite clear. The senator is not interested in me if I were a murderer, a thief, a liar, or a pervert. The senator is interested in attacking me because he is interested in destroying the movement.
He offered just to sort of disappear, not to continue. But A. Philip Randolph wouldn't have any part of that, and none of us would. This man was committed to the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. He had taught us the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence, and he was committed to the goals of the march. He was committed to the movement, and we had to stay with him.
That was the defining moment, I think, in Bayard Rustin's political life, when the civil rights movement was forced by circumstances to defend him rather than dismiss him.
Despite efforts to discredit Rustin, preparations for the march continued. And on August 28, 1963, 250,000 Americans gathered in Washington, demanding that Congress put an end to officially sanction racism.
Without Bayard Rustin as the organizer, the March on Washington would have been like a bird without wings. It was a sea of humanity. He had the ability to pull people together. He was able to reach out to hundreds and thousands of people all across America. Everybody, from the NAACP to the Protestant, Catholic, and Jews. He brought us all together.
They live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
That afternoon, in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, a parade of speakers offered words of inspiration to the crowd. Those spoken by Martin Luther King would be heard over and over again for decades to come. Bayard Rustin's would be all but forgotten.
Because of the stigma that attached to homosexuality, most Americans have no idea who he was and what he accomplished. So there's a way that Rustin is really a man without a history, and in certain ways is a lost prophet of nonviolence.
He was gay, and we have not had the courage. We have not had what I call raw courage to honor a man because of his sexuality.
Gays are beginning to realize what blacks learned long ago. Unless you are out here fighting for yourself, then nobody else will help you. I think the gay community has a moral obligation to continue the fight. Bayard Rustin.